Salutations, respected viewers. This video is a sort of review of the Autobiography of a Thief by Bruce Reynolds. Here it is. So Bruce Reynolds, in case you don't know, is the man who, according to himself, was the mastermind of the Great Train Robbery. That took place on the 9th of August, 1963. So Bruce Reynolds, he was born in London in 1931. His mother died when he was quite young. He came from a working class family. He was evacuated during the Second World War because children were sent out of London, major cities, because the bombs were falling. No reason the children need to risk being killed. Some people had to be in London for the war effort. They just stayed there. Anyway, he came back, and as a teenager, he got involved in petty crime. His family wasn't too badly off. As I say, they were proletarian, but they didn't lack for the necessities of life. He did it just because he was avaricious, and also for the buzz. So I won't go through all his crimes and all his adventures, deeds of daring do, his hiding out after the Great Train Robbery, where he netted something like £2.5 million. That's at least 10 times that value in current prices. How he escaped to Mexico, he eventually came back, blah, blah, blah. I shan't go through all the intricacies of his checkered criminal career. But it's a very engaging book, written in an entertaining style. He's eloquent. A lot of thieves are dim people, or academically subnormal, and fall into crime because they come from a broken home, or they just can't get a decent job because they lack for academic ability. Not the case with him. So he's clearly a man of above average intelligence, even though he left school at about 14. But in prison he had plenty of time to improve his mind, and said that he developed the greatest admiration for certain writers. And then in the 90s, we published in 1995, he chose to emulate their style. So this novel has pace. There you go. It reads like a novel. It's not a work of fiction. However, as I shall later point out, some of it appears to be fictionalized. It's thrilling, and I empathise with this character, even though I know he is a very bad man. He stole countless times, not out of necessity, and not out of anything close to necessity, out of sheer greed. When, as I say, he was a reasonably intelligent person, could have got a decently paid job, had proper jobs, certainly in his late teens. And then when he finally got out of prison in 1977, he was reduced to being a cleaner and working in a cafe, things of that nature. So there's plenty of lively dialogue, but because it's so well written, the reader puts himself in Bruce Reynolds' shoes, and quite exciting. There's some hair-breadth escapes, and are they going to catch me? Are they going to realise it's me? Hilarious moments, like after the Great Train Robbery, when he was living under an alias, and he was taking driving lessons. And his first driving lesson, the driving instructor says, by way of making conversation, I used to be a police detective. And Bruce Reynolds writes, I almost drove us off the road. You can imagine him hearing that and going, but obviously having to control yourself and not reveal just how petrified you are. So if only he had known, and things like that. But that moment was so good, it makes me wonder, is that true? Did he make that bit up? He actually said, this man said, I was in the flying squad. Metropolitan Police is the London Police, because London's a metropolis. Within that, there's the flying squad, formed in about 1920. The flying squad is dealing with organised crime, because obviously London's divided into different boroughs, but the flying squad, it moves from one borough to the other, goes wherever they have to catch armed robbers or deal with homicide, things like that. Anyway, so there are some scintillating character sketches of the people he meets, mainly his co-conspirators, and these gangsters, they come across as alluring characters. We've got to remember how vicious they were, because there was violence involved in this, definitely. People hit in the head with iron bars, things of that nature. Thank God nobody was killed, but they could just as well have been. It's sheer luck that nobody was killed. A blow to the head, even if it doesn't kill a person, can brain damage that person for life. So perhaps he wasn't brave at all, or his decency comes across that he loves certain people, he's decent to them. We've got to remember he seems to have no remorse whatsoever for the grief he causes to others. and he talks about how audacious he was at times, and indeed he was willing to run the risk of quite a few years in prison. So I think a lot of it is not true. For instance, after the Great Train Robbery, they chose to hide out at Leatherslade Farm, which is 27 miles away from the scene of the Great Train Robbery. The robbery took place at Bridego Bridge in Buckinghamshire. That's a bit outside London to the north-west. And the robbers, they were Londoners mostly, you think would drive back to London. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. But no, they drove north away, saying the obvious thing is to get back to London. The police will set up roadblocks. We'll go north. We find this very secluded farm. We'll hide out there. They bought it a few months before. And wait till the whole hoo-ha dies down, the roadblocks are lifted, and then we can drift back to London. And the farm was supposed to be cleaned up afterwards. And because it wasn't done properly, that's why they were apprehended. Because about a week later, the police came around and saw this abandoned farm. They had left mail bags, because they'd stolen mail bags full of cash. They'd left some Scottish banknotes. And this is what tied this hideaway to the crime. If those mail bags had been burnt, if the money had been taken and it was, or even burnt, there would be no reason to think this has got some connection to the crime. So obviously the robbers took the great majority of the money with them, but in their improvised and hasty departure from the farm, they didn't clean it up. And they'd obviously left their fingerprints everywhere. They supposedly cleaned some of them. Somebody else was supposed to pay to come and clean up the farm, was paid to, but that never happened. So Bruce doesn't name who it was. The various accounts by other criminals don't name who it was. And many people suggest there was no plan to do that. They didn't execute the end of the plan. The exit wasn't proper. And he says that when he left the farm, he hitchhiked. He picked a ride with two colonel types, and they gave him a lift because he was dressed up by them, which I suspect, again, is fantasy, because there are other accounts of it saying that he and most of the criminals, they had cars and they drove to Brian Field's house. Brian Field was a bent solicitor's clerk. He was in cahoots with criminals, and he'd arranged the purchase of the farm. That's how the police identified the criminals, because when they put him under severe pressure, Brian Field cracked and he spilled the beans, because Brian Field had never been under police interrogation in his life and couldn't stand up to questioning. So Bruce Reynolds going on about wearing cavalry twills, Donegal tweeds. He loves name-dropping these expensive couturiers like Turnbull and Asser, Harvey and Hudson and so on, saying, oh, well, I don't want to wear anything that's too blatant, things that only the cognoscenti would recognise. He likes dropping in phrases lifted from foreign languages. He often gets them wrong, like j'ai allé, as in, which should obviously be je suis allé, things like that. So he was a man who hankered after status. He suffered from status anxiety. It comes across in the book several times. Like when he was in prison as a teenager or at Borstal, he's saying to his mate, there's some criminals in the middle, they have to walk in circles around the yard for exercise. The higher risk escape ones are in the middle with a yellow stripe on their trousers. And he said, that's the cream, we got to be with the cream. And he claimed to detest the upper class, but he desperately wanted to ape them. He said he was a Marxist as an adolescent, so he loathed the establishment, but he wanted to be accepted by them. He was always trying to copy them, and when they are driving past the gates of an aristocrat's mansion, on the way to the Great Train Robbery, saying, no doubt they got this by brigandage themselves, which is probably true, because a lot of medieval aristocrats were what we now recognise as armed robbers, well, robber barons, we often describe them as. So he then fantasized about being accepted by the upper class and likened himself to people who'd sacked cities, like Sir Francis Drake and things like that. Difference is, of course, Francis Drake was at war fighting for his country and ran a high risk of being killed, whereas Bruce Reynolds didn't touch guns and was never being shot at. He liked wearing uniforms, pretending to be an army officer, saying, oh, but it wasn't for fantasy, and then later that same page he says, well, it was a fantasy. He can't get his story straight. It's also scintillating in this book in that it gives me a window into 1950s slang, expressions such as mooning about, not quite sure how we say that now, but just idling, I suppose. So he doesn't express the least sympathy for those he caused such harm to, not just stealing their money, but traumatizing them, beating them up. But it's replete with self-pity. felt so sorry for himself for the stretches he spent in prison and whining that the sentences were excessive. Sometimes he even thought the sentences were fair, which obviously meant they were too lenient. But long sentences definitely worked because it deterred him when he came out in prison from trying again. So he's very much extrinsically motivated. He craved acceptance or adulation from others. And to some extent, he got it in the criminal fraternity. He was always courting the media, telling his story like that. And he felt self-conscious as an adolescent about wearing glasses. Glenn Miller, well, he idolised that big band leader who was famous in the 40s, and when he disappeared over the English Channel, his plane crashed, presumably. And so he said, oh, well, my thick-rimmed glasses made me look a bit like Glenn Miller. And funnily enough, when he chose an assumed name, Bruce Reynolds called himself Clement Miller. And I thought, subconsciously, was he going for Clement Miller, for Glenn Miller? Because Miller is Miller, and Glenn, Clement, almost the same. The hard G and the hard C, G, K, virtually the same. L, E, that's the same. And then the N of Glenn, the M of Clement. So maybe that's where it comes from. Perhaps he didn't even realise that's why he's doing it. Of all the names he could have picked, isn't it odd that he chose that one? He named his son Nick. Again, is that nominative determinism? Nick in British slang, meaning to steal, or it can mean to arrest. The Nick can be prison, but there we are. So it's unputdownable. I've read it 4 times, so I give it my warmest recommendation. Don't consider this morally improving literature, but it's utterly riveting. You must read The Autobiography of a Thief by Bruce Reynolds.